Good morning. Tom Sutton's asked a really good question on Twitter last night. He was inspired by Sheffield United's performance and the mentality that Chris Wilder's players demonstrated. And he's asked the question just openly to coaches on Twitter. What do you do to focus, plan, deliver and execute on developing a mentality? Now, for me, there's two distinct kind of contexts to this. One is working in an academy environment with young players, and then the other one, which I'm going to focus on, is with a senior group playing in a league where results matter and league positions matter. So for me, it starts with what is your vision? What is your vision of what the mentality needs to be? You've got to identify that. If it just happens by luck over the course of the season, then you're not really in control and you're not setting out a process, and you're allowing the season to take you where it's going to take you, rather than you having a plan and understanding how you get from A to B and how you construct your process. So you've got to have a vision, and if that vision is, as Wilder has set out for Sheffield United, to build a real backs to the walls mentality, to get them fighting, and get them really, really organised, really highly motivated, physically at the races and mentally at the races for 94, 95 minutes every single game. That seems to me the kind of mentality that I think most teams would like to have. But obviously that's slightly different to, let's say, a Man City, where they've got the best players, they've got obviously the most money, more expectation as well, but they have a different strategy in terms of what they do with the ball, what they do when they don't have the ball, and they're operating at a slightly higher level in terms of the technical quality that they have. So it's determined a little bit by what your vision is. Once you have that vision, you've got to go and recruit players that reflect what you want. So for Wilder, he's gone out and got players like Ollie McBurney in, who is a really hard-working, probably good value in terms of a young player who he could add value to as well for a football club. But he probably embodies the type of spirit that he wants in his players. Who, he doesn't want forwards who are going to kind of walk around and look to drop into space and pick up and then come alive when they're on the ball. He needs 11 players who are all working as part of a unit and working at their maximum in terms of physical output. And that therefore has a bearing on the kind of mentality that he wants to create in the team. So he has that vision, he's identified that, he then creates an environment with his players, with his staff, and that environment is identified in the first place. So he sets out his rules, he sets out the do's and don'ts, he sets out the stuff that he won't accept, the prerequisites that the players have to come prepared with every day into work. And that has to be identified at the start of the season. So this is kind of like a project kickoff type scenario, where you have a meeting with everyone and you say, this is what we expect as a minimum in these areas, and these are things we're trying to achieve. And to get from here to here, we need to see you act in this way, and we're going to act in this way, and we're going to create an environment that values this type of behaviour. And then once you know that, everyone in the group understands where they're at and they have a starting point. They might not be acting like that there and then, which then takes you into kind of the execution phase. And the execution phase is about, as a leader, there's two things you can do. You can behave in a certain way that gradually, organically develops the motivation and the mentality in the players. That's about consistency of behaviour. It's about identifying specific things that you want and reinforcing those on a consistent basis, and not being inconsistent and not being untrue to the plan. If you have a coach who goes in there and says, well, really important that you're punctual and that you turn up for work 5 minutes before rather than 5 minutes after, and then the coach himself starts to turn up 5 minutes late, that's not the kind of consistency that you need in terms of your behaviour and your leadership. So you can really underestimate that side of things. If you constantly lead by example, then you're going to drag some of the players along with you, and their mentality over time will improve. But on top of that, you've also got to give them experiences, and this is where I guess the delivery in sessions and the delivery in what you do in the coaching processes really come to the fore. So in sessions, you can create environments that instill a competitive nature into the players, that pit the players against each other a little bit, that give opportunities for small groups to develop, and for understanding to develop within the squad, within the dressing room, within that group. And examples would be, and one example that I've always looked at is that Louis Lancaster has, I think he put it up a few years ago and said this is the players' session. It's the one session that he always goes back to and says it's his favourite session because it's the players' favourite session. And it's basically breaking up the training session into 4 or 5 activities that are small-sided games, are different types of small-sided games with points awarded for the team that wins each one, and then it's like a carousel scenario, and they move on to the next game. So you'll have Reds versus Whites. You'll have, I don't know, if you've got a training group of 18 players, then there'll be, all 18 players will be engaged, 9 versus 9, but in separate groups and in separate activities, and then they, on a carousel basis, they go to the next. And if you can start to develop that over a period of time, then you start to develop a competitive nature where losing isn't acceptable, or losing is really frowned upon. Another really good example of this, in terms of the experience that you give players, I love the concept of doing the opposite of punishments at the end of a session. I like the idea of actually punishing, in traditional terms, the winners. So if in that scenario that in Louis' session, if you say, okay, the Whites have won this week, they get to do a little bit extra work in terms of the physical bodies over there with the strength and conditioning guy, the rest of you go get showered. They're getting that extra benefit out of the session, and the perception is that the more hard work that they get, the more successful it is, because they've been more successful. And I love the idea that creates. Andy Foster told me about it a while back, and I thought it was a fantastic idea, and it's something that I've not really had the opportunity to do enough yet, because I've worked with younger players since, and it probably hasn't been the right thing to do. But that in itself is an experience that you give the players in terms of your sessions, where you're starting to get the message across that extra hard work, and you don't know what your body's capable of for a start off. And on a match day, we know that on the 92nd minute, when you need to put your body on the line to block when we're 1-0 up, that you're going to be able to do that, because we push you to those lengths when you're successful. And it's kind of like an organic process. So just to repeat, it's your behaviour and then the experiences you give the players, and it can be in training sessions, it can be in the dressing room, it can be in your strength and conditioning work that your other staff deliver, it can be in any scenario that you have contact or influence. Doesn't necessarily need to be physically. It can be in your communication via phone. It can be on a phone call. It can be in the homework that you set your players. If you set your players homework in terms of analysis of their performances, in terms of them taking ownership, and the amalgamated, the aggregated sum of all those scenarios is what creates the mentality in the players. But there's kind of two categories, I guess. There's the time and patience stuff, which is what I've just talked about, and then there's the X factor, and that's what distances the greatest coaches, in my opinion, from the coaches who are good at their job, really good at their job in terms of delivery, but they don't have that X factor. Wilder's got the X factor, because if you listen to his video about Josephine's and the various places he's been around Sheffield, that's not only is that a message to the fans, that's also a message to the players. The players will watch that, and first of all they'll have a giggle at it, but that's going to make them want to play for their gaffer. There's no two ways about it. He has a way of pulling on the heartstrings of his players and getting that extra 5% out of them when they don't think they can do any more. And that's the X factor that they've got. Final thing I'll say is probably the best process I've been involved in in instilling a mentality was training camp before the Island Games with Guernsey side a few years ago. And Colin Fallet, the assistant manager, is probably the most influential motivator in sport that I've ever really had regular contact with. He's just an unbelievable man, unbelievable human being, and someone who instills, who's the best, I think, at instilling a mentality into players. People want to do it for him. But he's rowed across the English Channel. He's done all sorts of big charity stuff. Fantastic sportsman in his own right before he started coaching. But in his coaching work, he's not necessarily the most technical, tactical minded coach, but he takes people on a journey. And between him and Vancy and the other staff there, and I was involved as a kind of support coach and did some scouting and stuff. But the players they were pitted against each other over a period of time on the training camp. So they created these teams, and while some of the work was functional and technical and tactical, some of it was competitive, and that there was a consistency about that over, I think, an 8-week period to 2 or 3 sessions a week that developed a feeling within the group of friendly but incredibly competitive rivalry that brought the group together phenomenally. And it was all sorts of different activities, all sorts of daft things. It wasn't just football related. Some of it was physical, some of it was almost post-football type stuff in the dressing room. But the key thing was it created this really organic process where these players, they went when they pulled on the shirt and when they got into the games program, they had a level of understanding amongst themselves and a shared ownership and a mentality that was way above where it had been 8 weeks earlier because of the work that he'd done. And that was X Factor stuff and really good planning processes. So to wrap up, those are the kind of things that I'd be thinking about in terms of a performance group, a senior group. In terms of the academy groups, Tom and a lot of the other guys, Mikey and the other guys on that tweet, you'll have much more experience. You're working in a professional game day in, day out. The one thing I would say is I don't envy you, because working with this generation of young players, you don't get natural leadership qualities from kids. You don't get natural ownership and accountability from players like you did 30, 40 years ago. And we can be very harsh about and make sweeping generalizations about the snowflake generation. That's not always the case. It's not always true. I get where people are coming from, but there is a softer side and a more complicated side to the psyche of young players. And there's also more control in terms of more regulations in terms of how you're actually meant to behave around those kids. So the old school YTS process of getting them cleaning the stadium and washing the boots and washing the changing rooms out and doing all that stuff, that did help to develop understanding and mentality in players. And you don't have those tools in your toolkit anymore. So it's a tough job you guys have got, but it's a really important one for the future of the game, because you've got to find some way to continue to create the mentality that you saw in Chris Wilder's players last night, and perhaps they're the exception rather than the rule these days, and that might be why they're successful and can differentiate themselves and compete at the top level. So those are my thoughts. I'm interested to hear what everyone else has to say. Great question, Tom. Yeah, have a good week. I'm interested to see how Chris Wilder's group get on over the course of this season, but they're an impressive group, and I was inspired by them as much as everyone who watched it last night. All right, all the best, fellas.